Okay, welcome to a quick video about how to land the DCS F-18 Hornet in the overhead brake and overhead pattern using US Air Force procedures. We're going to use some numbers from USAF. Obviously, there are other videos online talking about different techniques for this, and you can see some good videos from the Australian Hornet squadrons about how to use the Australian run-in and brake procedures. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff about how to fly the Hornet at the boat based on how the US Navy do it. This is how to land at Ashore field with a US Air Force overhead pattern. So what does the overhead pattern look like in general? Obviously, there's a runway, and the basics of the overhead pattern is that we're going to fly in a straight line to a point midfield. We're going to brake, which is a hard decelerating level turn in US Air Force land, to turn to the downwind. We're going to fly downwind to a position normally called the perch, or the beginning of the base turn or final turn, and we're then going to turn in one continuous turn and arrive lined up to land on the runway about a mile from the runway threshold and about 450 feet. And that's what the pattern looks like. Where does it start? Well, it starts back out here at a point we call the initial, and the initial is typically 5 nautical miles from the runway threshold technically, but often we use a TACAN navigation station to judge this 5 nautical miles. And at 5 nautical miles, you should be lined up on the runway heading, and you should be at the pattern altitude and your initial airspeed. Now, the pattern altitude in US Air Force land is normally 1500, excuse my scrappy writing, 1500 AGL. Now, we're going to show a video in a minute of doing this at Nellis. Nellis has a threshold elevation of 1852 feet, and these get rounded up to make sure that your pattern altitude is always at least 1500. So Nellis, it's rounded up to 2000, add the 1500, which gives you a pattern altitude of 3500 feet MSL. So that's the pattern altitude at Nellis. It's worth knowing if that roundup has happened, because if your pattern altitude is absolutely at 1500, that's great. But if it's a bit higher, so at Nellis it's more like 1700 or 1650, then your turn here obviously is going to have to be a little bit more downhill. You're going to have to make a steeper descent just to account for that slightly increased above ground altitude that you've got. Airspeeds for the run-in from initials in the Hornet, we normally use 350 knots. The range, really, the kind of sensible range for the Hornet is probably 250 to 450 knots. And if you want to be a bit silly about it, you could probably go up to about 600. But really, 250 to 450, but as close to 350 as you can. There's not a fantastically good reason to deviate from that. Going a bit quicker is fine, going a bit slow is fine. So at the initial at 5 miles, 5 miles from the threshold or the TACAN beacon, we're going to be at 350 knots. We're going to be at 3500 MSL, 1500 AGL, and lined up on the runway heading. So at Nellis for runway 21, this is 209 degrees magnetic. So you can use a TACAN radial to line you up approximately at Nellis. There's 2 runways, but you can judge that. At initial, you're going to have completed the descent before landing checklist in the Hornet. So this is something to do. This is to be completed by the time you get to initial. So quite a lot of this involves a fair bit of being heads down. So master arm, engine ice, pitot heat, defog, windshield, that kind of stuff. That's all for your descent, really. That should be done at the top of the descent. Anti-skid on for field operations. We're going to have that on. Altimeter, you're going to check that set to the field elevation, and we conventionally don't fly, if we're using US Air Force procedures, we don't fly using QFE, or we set the QNH, so we should see that showing 3500. Rad alt, we're going to set that for 450 feet for shore-based operations. We're going to be in nav to show our nav aids up, and we're going to check that we've got the field TACAN displayed. ILS, obviously not applicable for a field landing in the Hornet. and then the rest is really as desired. Landing lights are generally on for the field, and gear handle down appears on this checklist, but actually we're going to do that much later. This would be for straight in. You'd need item 17, but we don't need that for what we're doing yet. We will, obviously. So that's going to be done at initial, and then we're going to run in at 350 knots at 1500, and we're going to run in to midfield in the Hornet is just best place to start the brake. Helpfully just crashed. Let's start again. Midfield is the best place to start the brake in the DCS Hornet, and we're going to offset. What we do is we make sure, if we ideally over the runway or offset a little bit away from the brake. You don't want to be offset this side, because it means that this turn is going to have to be tighter, and it compresses your pattern. So if you're offset, you're offset away from the direction of the brake, so the pattern's more gentle, more relaxed, bigger than you expect. At 350 knots, midfield, 1500 AGL, you're going to start a brake turn, and the brake turn is typically 1% of this airspeed. So if you start at 350 knots, it's 3.5, 1% G. So you're going to make a 3.5 G turn. Slightly different schools of thought about whether you hold that initial 1% or whether you fly the 1% of the airspeed you have. So as you're decelerating round this turn, you start at 350, you might be at 270 here. Well, are you at 2.7 G here, or are you still at 3.5? It sort of depends whether you're going to fly one continuous smooth turn or whether you're going to fly a hard bit and then gently ease it out. Most people, I think, do this. So as they decelerate, they're constantly aiming for holding 1% of the airspeed they're at. So as you decelerate 300, you should be at 3G, 270, you should be at 2.7. And you ideally want to be rolling out here at 250 knots or below. So your final sort of G should be 2.5. Now, as you come to here, obviously you're going to relax and roll out gently to capture this reciprocal heading, which again, Nellis reciprocal 209.029, going downwind. You need to remember any crosswind correction. So if you've got a crosswind coming from this way, you need to be aiming off, and you can judge that in general. You're on here in the Hornet, you're going to be going at about 170 knots, which is close enough to half of your 350 that you could just double the crosswind correction you were using here. So when you were flying in on your initials, if there was wind from this side and you had to aim off, say 5 degrees at 350 knots, when you're going half the speed, 170 knots, you can just double that correction, so that 5 degrees becomes a 10-degree aim off over here. Hopefully that makes sense. Right, let's clear up this sketch and make a new one. So there's the runway. We're using headings of 029. We're using Nellis headings of 209 here. TACAN's in the middle. So there's our initial 5, run in, brake. We start the brake, we said, at 350 knots at 1500 AGL. We're going to fly that 1% G of airspeed brake and capture the reciprocal, the downwind here, and we're still at 1500 AGL. Once we've finished the brake turn, we need to be 250 knots or less. And that's essentially the gear speed in the Hornet. Now, you often find that you get to 250 knots partway through the brake turn, and as soon as you're at 250 knots, the gear and the flaps can travel. So gear comes down and flaps come down when you capture 250 knots, wherever that is during your brake turn. Now, you can do that all in one go, that's fine. You can travel the gear and then wait a bit and travel the flaps in a couple of stages. The official procedure is just to basically smack everything down all in one go. If you do that with the full flaps at 250 knots, be expecting the jet to climb quite aggressively, to have a sort of balloon with the extra lift from the flaps. but that does get you slowing down more quickly. So if you've done this brake fast, if you've entered at 400 or 450 or something, you'll be at 250 quite late in the turn, and you do really want to get all that down quickly and accept that you're going to balloon up and you're going to have to push in a lot of forward stick, and it really is quite a lot to keep the jet level on this 1500 AGL. If you've done a more sort of relaxed brake starting at 350, then your 250 will probably arrive quite early and you'll have time to travel the gear, wait a bit, slow down a bit more, go half flaps and go full flaps. Aim to be rolling out wings level on the downwind, configured, or at the very least the gear down and traveling, and the flaps at half and about to put your final notch of flaps in. For those of you that have come from civilian air flying, something in civilian land that we don't do a lot is travel our flaps when we're in the bank, because if we get asymmetric flap travel, then we can have a bad day. In a fast jet where you've got lots of roll authority, not such an enormous problem. You're not going to immediately crash if the low wing flap doesn't travel. So don't worry about traveling the flaps in the brake turn. So you're rolled out going downwind, plus minus any wind correction, and you're decelerating probably through 200 knots here, and hopefully you've done this turn absolutely level, including traveling the gear and the flaps, and you're still at 1500 AGL. What's going to happen is you're going to slow down and you're aiming to be on speed going on the downwind. Now, one of the things about the Hornet is as it slows towards on speed, you get a quite precipitous and sudden lift loss. So what will happen is you'll be pushing the stick forward to keep level, and you'll be slowing down and you'll come through 170, 160 knots, depending on the aircraft weight, and suddenly you'll reach critical AOA, and you'll decelerate through that, and suddenly you'll go from pushing the stick forward to stop the aircraft climbing to stick in the middle, and then you'll be pulling back to keep the aircraft level. And that's because you haven't got enough power in, and you need to anticipate that. So you need to have some feel for, at the aircraft weight you're landing at, what's on speed, what's it going to be. And you can either look that up or just get a feel for it. And as you feel the aircraft start to get a bit heavy, as you don't have to push that forward stick in, as the stick starts to come back to the middle, anticipate that you're going to start sinking. Feed in power early. Allow the engines time to spool up to get power and to stop you sinking. One of the most common mistakes that people make is as they get to here, they wait until the aircraft's starting to come to on speed. As they see it reaching on speed, they push the throttles forward to try and capture that on speed setting, and the problem is that they're too late. The engines aren't spooled up because they're idle all the way through this turn. I should have mentioned that. Obviously, when you start the brake turn, you go to idle to slow down during the turn. But they've had the engines idle all the way around, idle, and then suddenly they go, oh, I'm almost on speed. Now I want power. They push the throttles forward. There's a compressor lag, and they don't have any power. So just anticipate that. A few techniques you can use as you come down through 200 knots. You can feed in a little bit of power just to spool the compressor back up. I'm not sure how well DCS models this, but just to spool the compressor so that you get faster throttle response. And really, if you're going to do that, you want to spool it to 77 to 78% RPM, or just anticipate, be at idle, and before you feel the aircraft starting to sag, to wallow and sink, power in and capture on speed, and aim to capture a little bit faster than on speed and then slow nicely to it. Don't fall slow below on speed. It's one of the gotchas in the Hornet, both in DCS and the real world, that is a mistake. So you slow to on speed, you slow to slightly fast, capture that slightly fast, and then you slow nicely to on speed. And if you do that without trimming, you'll find that you're having to be pulling back on the stick to maintain level, that on speed indication. So assuming you know how to fly the Hornet in reverse controllability here with throttle for climb and descent control and trim for airspeed or stick for airspeed, what you should be aiming to do is to capture that on speed both with a throttle setting and a trim. So as you're here, as you're slowing through that 200 knots, you start to feed in a bit of power. And what you'll normally find is that as you come down through about 170 knots, you'll start to feel the aircraft get a little heavy. The stick will be coming back towards the middle, and that's the time to start feeding in a bit of throttle and as your left hand moves forward with the throttle, your right thumb should be going with the up trim, and they happen together. So as you're slowing on this section here from kind of whatever the end of your brake turn is, let's call it 220 that you roll out of the brake turn, as you're slowing down here to on speed, which is going to be 130 something depending on your weight, through this transition there comes a point where the aircraft starts to feel heavy, and once it starts to settle, and you know that from the your right hand coming back, you're not having to hold the aircraft down anymore. Once you feel that, power comes in with the left hand, right thumb goes with the up trim, and they happen together. More power, more trim, more power, more trim, to capture on speed AOA and level flight. And that's on speed AOA, that's the trim that's controlling that, and level flight, that's the throttle. Okay, so you should therefore be set up by here, by the level with the threshold you're going to land. You should be on speed at 1500 AGL, and you should be about 1.5 miles ish from the runway threshold. Tends to be about, I mean, if you know where the TACAN beacon is, and you know that offset, you can kind of glance at your TACAN here. You can eyeball it. What this looks like from the aircraft is when you look out over the wing, when you kind of look back at the runway, you'll see the runway, and you'll see the wing, and you'll see the rail, the sidewinder rail, and the runway should be just a little bit undefined, little bit depending on your view, obviously outside of the rail there. If the runway's in here, you are too close. But yeah, this should maybe be like, if you think about the sidewinder fins, it should maybe be like that, sort of one fin width away from where a fin would be, or the full sidewinder empennage away from the wingtip mid-rail point. So that's your lateral offset. And what you're going to do is you're going to fly to your perch, and that is essentially, when you look again back over the wing, you want to see the landing threshold, or the touchdown point where you're aiming for on the runway. You want to, when that passes the back edge of the wing, that's roughly at the perch. You can use the front edge of the wing, you can use somewhere in here, but that's your kind of range for starting the base turn. Is the touchdown point is past the front edge of the wing and not yet popped out the back edge of the wing. Anything out here, you're turning late, and anything out here, you're turning early, really. Again, that's slightly variable depending on the height of the runway, and also your lateral distance. So it's a good ballpark if you're on the numbers. When you get here, you're going to start the base turn, and this is the point at which you're going to call that you are turning base. So for a USAF pattern, that would be call sign and the base turn call. So something like, buzzard 11, left base, gear down, full stop, runway 21 right, LS. When you start this turn, this is similar to the carrier turn, but it's descending. Obviously, when you're at the carrier, you're at 600 feet here, and you're aiming for, losing less than a few hundred feet throughout the turn. Whereas here at the field, we're at 1500 AGL here, and we're aiming to roll out at a mile at 450. So you've got a significant amount of altitude to lose in this turn. So if you think about it, if you call this, if you call your target end altitude 300, 450 to 500, you've got something between, that's kind of the range, you've got something between 1,000 and 1,200 feet to lose in this turn. The closer you are to the runway, the closer you need to be to 300. If you're kind of out at 1.1 nautical miles, you're at 500, and it's 3/4 of a mile here, you're probably at 300. The reason in the Hornet, the RADALT recommendation is to set it to 450 feet for the field, is that should go off just as you start to roll wings level on the final here. So that should be 450 ideally you should hear the radar alert just as you roll out, as you start to roll out wings level, and you should be rolled out wings level and stabilized by 303/4 of a mile. So you're at 1500 AGL here, you're aiming for that 400 here. You've got 1100 feet of altitude to lose, and you're going to try and lose that fairly symmetrically throughout the turn. So you're going to lose about 550 feet per 90 degrees of turn. So you're aiming to be somewhere around 1000 AGL halfway through the turn, and 500, 450 as you start to roll out. Okay, so at Nellis, the pattern altitude's 3,500. This halfway gate is having lost 500, and we said at the beginning it's worth remembering that some of these patterns are a little bit higher than 1,500, and Nellis is one of those. So at Nellis we're losing a little bit more than the 550. So our this is our pattern, and then at the 90. Halfway through the turn, we've actually lost a little bit more than the 550. We've lost 600, so it's 2,900, and then we roll out here at 450 plus the 1850, 1,900, 2,300 at 3/4 of a mile MSL. So pretty much 600 and 600 to lose, because the pattern analysis is a bit high. If it was a spot on 1500, it would be 5 and 5, or 550 and 550. Okay, so that's the final turn, and that's quite steep. So for those of you used to flying a boat pattern in the Hornet, where you sort of tiny amount of nose down, 1 degree nose down, something like that, and 450 foot per minute, this looks totally different from the cockpit. When you initially roll in, the best way of doing this is with a reasonable overbank, so sort of 45 degrees to start the turn, to get it going, and let the nose drop to at least 5 degrees nose down. And sometimes if it's a high pattern and there's a tightening wind and you need to make this happen quickly, even 10 degrees nose down through the first part to get the altitude off, get the nose traveling down. It's going to look like about a 5 degree nose down during the base turn, and in the video that's coming up, what you'll see is me do this and not have enough nose down during the first half of the turn and arrive high at the 90, and then have to correct through the second half. So then you're going to roll out on final. You've got to remember that as you roll in and roll out, you're flying in this reverse controllability region, so you're going to have to add power transiently as you're rolling in, and you're going to have to take out power transiently as you roll wings level. So add a squirt of power, roll to 30 degrees angle of bank, but not add too much power, because you do want the nose to fall. Get the nose established 10 degrees nose down, take that power back out, get it tracking something between 5 and 10 degrees nose down, check your altitude at the 90, keep turning with 30 degrees angle of bank, arrive here, take out a handful of power, roll wings level, add power back in, and establish on a 3 degree glide slope going down to the runway. Obviously, Hornet, you don't have to flare, but you can at the field. Flare techniques, there are basically two. One is you can either be slightly fast, trim for slightly fast, and then your flare is essentially idle and back stick, and that just brings the aircraft to on speed and a slow AOA to land. The other alternative is you fly the whole thing on speed, and then as you arrive over your landing point, you take out power and manually flare, but you do have to take out a good chunk of power. Otherwise, it's quite easy to float the Hornet. It's got quite a lot of lift in this configuration. So in the video, you'll see the second technique. That's on speed for the whole way, and then the flare being idle throttle and stick flare to land with the nose high and slow. I don't know. I've not seen any sort of reliable sources as to which of those is definitively better. Probably depends on your landing weight, your crosswind configuration, things like that. So that's the overview of the overhead. So basically 5 mile initials at at your altitude and airspeed, 350, 1500, run in midfield, call the brake, 1% of G brake, roll out on the reciprocal below 250. As soon as you hit 250 gear, travel your flaps either with the gear or a little bit after. Aim to be rolled out wings level on the reciprocal with gear down and the final notch of flaps travelled or travelling. Let the aircraft slow. Before you hit on speed, anticipate the lift loss, feed in some power, feed in back trim to smoothly capture slightly above on speed, 5 to 10 knots above on speed, level flight. Then continue gently decelerating to on speed. Be on speed, level with the threshold at 1.5 miles separation, trimmed for level flight and hands off the stick essentially. So you're just trimmed for on speed and you're controlling climb and descent with the throttle. Reach the perch, call the base turn and roll in, either order. Get the nose down, hard down between 5 and 10 degrees. Let the aircraft descend. Check your altitude at the 90. Should have lost 550 to 600 feet in the first 90 of turn. Continue turning. Anticipate the extra lift. So take out power, roll wings level, put power back in at 450 with the rad alt going off at 1 mile from the runway. Fly a 3-degree glide slope, flared or not flared, and land the aircraft on the centre line or on your side of the runway, depending on whether you're doing a formation or how you're landing. Obviously, if you're doing this as a formation, then you're going to do this in echelon left, and everybody's going to brake sequentially to the right at 4 to 5 second intervals. If you're doing this as a 4-ship, the flight lead might have to bring their brake back nearer the numbers. 5 seconds, obviously, that's 5, 10, 15 seconds at 350 knots. You just need to make sure that you're not busting any airspace at the far end of that for those intervals. But the intervals are much shorter than they are at the boat, so you don't have to worry too much about going miles and miles down here. So you can fit a 4-ship kind of comfortably along the length of, say, Nellis's runway is 10,000 feet. So, so if you brake at the numbers, your number 4 isn't going that far beyond the end of the runway. Hopefully that makes sense. We've got a video just coming up to show what that looks like at LS.
So here we are, 6 mile initials, lining up for 21 right at Nellis, TACAN, distance displayed on the HUD. Just going to grab the checklist page up, go for 350 knots, 3,500 feet, landing checklist. Will be on the finals turn, and pre-descent checklist's already run. Landing lights on, hooks in field, and skids on, launch bars retract. Going for 350 knots, 3,500 feet, lining up just on the left-hand edge of the runway. We're braking to the right over 21 right. Try and catch this. There's 350. We're going to brake about midfield in the Hornet. You can brake over the numbers, but it gives you very short downwind. So midfield's about at the Lola there. So there's midfield, call the brake, buzzard 1-1 in the brake. Bit too snappy, throttles to idle. We're pulling 3.5 G, aiming for 1% of airspeed. As we come down, we're just relaxing the G off. As we come to 250 knots, we're going to travel the gear. Gear travels. Rolling out 1.5 miles from the TACAN. Wings level, full flaps. As the flaps travel, so we're holding back stick in, keeping the aircraft straight and level. And as soon as we see the bracket start to move, we're going to push some power in because we need to lead for the spool up on the Hornet engines. There we go, lead, back trim to take the back stick out. Trimming for on speed, bit too much trim. Power coming back in, trimming, check our beam distance, we're good. Power for level and trim, checking there. We're going to carry this a little long to not overfly the racetrack. There we go, so looking for our final turn mark. landing point off the wingtip. That's about there. So that would be our final turn. So 3 gears, full flaps, buzzard 1-1, right base, gear, stop, 21 right. Power getting fed back in so we don't get excessive descent rate. Aiming for at least 5 degrees nose down. We've probably done that a bit shallow. Taking a look. Catching up. We're at the 90 and we're 100 to 200 foot high at the 90. So we're keeping the descent rate. We knew that because we were shallow on the initial turn. Just taking a look. We're still a bit high. Still high. Power coming out as we roll to wings level. Still high. And we're going to put the landing aim point. So we're going to use the white squares on 3 degree down. So we're still a bit high. Still traveling low. And there we go, 450 at a mile. That was pretty good. So we're pretty much on glide slope. Just going to aim for the bit of tarmac between the 2 white squares as our touchdown point. We can flare the Hornet at the field. We don't need to. We're 1,000 foot per minute descent rate. We're going to put a little flare in, coming onto center line. It'll kick a right rudder, little bit of flare, power coming out, power coming out, power coming out on the center line. Power to idle. Keep the center line, keep the landing rolling out. No speed brake if you don't need it. And then 100 knots, full back stick, speed brake if you want, and wheel brakes if you want. If you're going to wheel brake, it's full brakes until 35 knots ground speed. So, just going to check. I've got left brakes. I've got right brakes. 3,000 feet of runway remaining. I'm going to go smoothly to full brakes and keep the center line. Full brakes, full brakes. Coming down through 55 of ground speed on the HSI. And there's 35 half brakes. Stick forward, flaps up, speed brakes closed. Take the cold side and taxi to the turn off.